Hi class, this is Professor Hindrocker, and today we're going to be going over your Cat 4 review. We have 10 questions, and we're going to be starting with question 1 here that involves our squat 1 video. During the descent, the action of the hip joint is blank, and it is occurring in the blank plane. Let's watch this squat real quick. The descent, as she's coming down, she's flexing at the hip. So the action occurring at the joint is flexion. And flexion and extension, as we know, occur in the sagittal plane, so it can't be occurring in the frontal plane. So both of these are not an option. It has to be extension or flexion. She's clearly flexing at the hip joint, and as she ascends, she's extending. Okay? Moving on to question 2. During the ascent, one of the agonists at the hip joint is the blank, and it is contracting blank. So it's important to remember that we have 4 major prime movers, 4 agonist muscles at the hip. Those muscles are our glute max, our semimembranous, our semitendinosus, and our biceps femoris. So we can automatically cross out vastus medialis and psoas major because they are not prime movers of the hip joint. And we have glute max and biceps femoris. So now we have to come to a conclusion of what kind of contraction is occurring. So as she's ascending, she's standing up, her muscles are concentrically contracting, meaning her muscles are shortening. All right? And as she's descending, that means that her muscles are eccentrically contracting, they're elongating. So for this specific question, because it has to do with ascension, she is, one of the agonists at the hip joint would be the biceps femoris, and she is contracting concentrically. Question number 3. During the descent, the hip joint is being controlled by the psoas major muscle. So that's automatically false if you know, you go back to question 2 and you remember the 4 major muscles that are the prime movers for the hip. In order for this question to be true, you would have to have one of those muscles listed instead of the psoas major. Alright, question 4. The athlete's left hip is contracting blank, while the right hip is contracting blank. So he's loaded here, he's sprinting, he's coming right out of the gate, and his hip is contracting concentrically, which means his muscles are shortening. It's a quick burst, and he's not fully elongating all of his muscles. So the hip is contracting concentrically, while the left hip is contracting concentrically here, all right, while the right hip is contracting concentrically here. Moving on to question 5. All of the following are agonists at the left hip joint except your gluteus medius. So that goes back to questions 2 and 3, where we listed all 4 major prime movers, all 4 agonists at the hip, which would be glute max, semimembranosus, semitendinosus, and biceps femoris. Gluteus medius is not an agonist muscle at the hip joint. Question 6. Using the image below, answer question 6 and 7. So, assuming the patient's right foot is moving from the right to the left, in the picture, this is your tip here, the action at the hip joint is blank. Alright, so assuming that his right foot right here in the picture is moving from right to left, the action at the hip joint would be internal rotation. Alright, internal rotation at the hip occurs inwards as opposed to if he was bringing his right foot in towards the right, and that would be external rotation. He's not flexing at the hip right now, and he's not abducting at the hip. He's internally rotating. Question number 7. The agonist for this movement is, and it gives us 4 muscles, psoas major, piriformis, gluteus medius posterior fibers, and gluteus medius anterior fibers. Well, he's sitting down, so he's clearly using his glutes while he's doing this internal and or external rotation. And the important thing to note here is that while internal rotation is occurring, the anterior fibers are assisting in that internal rotation. So if you remember your glute medius fibers, you have anterior fibers and you have posterior fibers. The anterior fibers are working with internal rotation, and the posterior fibers are working with external rotation. So clearly, if you answered this question correctly, he's internally rotating at the hip, then you can conclude that you can answer this question correctly. He is using the agonist movement. The agonist for this movement is the gluteus medius, the anterior fibers, because they assist in internal rotation. Question 8. On the ascent, the action of the hip joint is extension. So let's watch this video. She's descending right now, and now she's ascending. Alright, so the action at the hip joint as she ascends is extension. This goes back to question 1 when we were talking about our squat. She's clearly doing a deadlift, an RDL, sorry, she's clearly doing an RDL here, and she's extending as she comes up, okay? Flexing would be completely different. She's coming down. It's asking about the ascension, which includes extension, whereas if she's coming down, she's flexing. Question number 9. Due to the heavily eccentric nature of this movement, it is especially valuable in developing the blank muscles, so hip agonists in this movement. We'll read it again. Due to the heavily eccentric nature of this movement, so let's break that down first. Eccentric contraction means that your muscles are elongating. It is especially valuable in developing the blank muscles. So if you go back up to watch this RDL, think about what muscles she's using as she ascends and descends. Due to the heavily eccentric nature of this movement, so she's elongating her muscles, the muscles she's specifically elongating and are especially valuable in developing during this movement are the hamstrings. So that would be your semimembranosus, semitendinosus, and your biceps femoris. They are all hard to say, but all 3 of those are especially valuable in developing the hamstring muscles because they're hip agonists in this movement. You can clearly cross out your gastrocnemius because it's not a prime mover for the hip and your erector spinae and your quadriceps femoris. Question 10. The most significant danger in performing this movement with a client who has poor hamstring flexibility is blank. Posterior pelvic tilt leading to flexion of the lumbar spine under load, anterior pelvic tilt leading to extension of the lumbar spine under load, increased knee flexion, and increased knee extension. So what's important to remember is that we're going over the hip this week. That's kind of your tip or your little clue that it really shouldn't be knee flexion or knee extension. These are just 2 options where, we're talking about the hip in this question. We've talked about the hip throughout the entire CAP 4. So these should not necessarily, they should be examined because they are connected. Obviously, everything is connected as the ankle is to the knee is to the hip. But we're talking primarily about the hip, so I would conclude that we need to look at posterior and anterior pelvic tilt. So the most significant danger in performing this movement with a client who has poor hamstring flexibility would be posterior pelvic tilt leading to flexion of the lumbar spine under load. So if your hips are neutral, so here, all right, while performing an RDL, if your hamstrings are weak, you have the opportunity to then posterior pelvic tilt. So your tail is almost coming under. So if you've ever seen a dog tuck its tail, or you've been in the gym and a trainer and said, tuck your tail, all right, that's posterior pelvic tilt, leading to flexion of the lumbar spine under load. So she's clearly carrying a lot of weight as she's doing this. Let's look one more time. It's a lot of weight. And as she comes up, if she has poor hamstring strength, then she can posterior pelvic tilt, meaning her pelvis is going to rotate forward. Coming back down. A hint that they give you here is to examine the origin of the agonist in this movement. So if you remember your origins, you should know where all of your agonists originate from, and that should be able to help you remember that it's going to be posterior pelvic tilt. If it was anterior pelvic tilt, the hips would rotate back slightly, right? So this is not as dangerous because then your hamstrings are still carrying a good amount of the load. But if your hamstrings are if your hamstrings have really poor flexibility, they can't elongate enough, then your hamstrings are going to pull hard on your pelvis, and your pelvis is going to rotate up, which can cause a lot of stress and a lot of tension on your lower back. It can cause pain and can cause slipping of discs, and ultimately you can become injured. So if you have any further questions on this CAP, I know there's a lot of information inside of it, and most of this is learned by you just doing it. So we can talk about it all we want on a video, but I would really encourage you to take all of these questions, take the videos that they did, and do it yourself, or have somebody do it for you in your home or at the gym, and someone that you're familiar with, a friend, a spouse, a family member, and ask them, hey, can I touch your lumbar spine? Can I touch your hips as you're doing this exercise so that you better understand this content? When we practice it ourselves, if you were to get in the stance and practice it yourself, you would feel that you're concentrically contracting your left hip and in your right hip. Also, if you go down here and you do an RDL, you're going to understand that as you descend, you're what? You're flexing at the hip. As you ascend, you're extending at the hip. So these are all movements that we can watch in a video, or I can explain to you in a video, but they're best learned by you as a student when you practice them in real life. So I would really encourage you to do that outside of just watching this CAP review. So if you have any further questions, go ahead and send me an email. I am happy to get back to you within a day or 2 days. I typically will get back to you within 24 hours. That's the goal. So if you have any questions, please feel free to email myself or email Professor Garrett, and we would be happy to help you all. So I hope you have a great rest of your week, and make sure you're studying hard for your final exam. I know you all do great. Have a great rest of your week, and I'll talk to you all later.